In the last section, we created graphs for qualitative data, so for categorical variables. In this section, we're going to switch to making just one kind of graph, really, for quantitative data. And the process for quantitative data is very similar, but there are a few key differences. So as we go along, we're going to talk about those key differences as well as looking at where the process was the same. Now, the most important difference happens because for qualitative data, our variable can only take on a few values. On the other hand, for quantitative numeric data, there are lots and lots of numbers, right? So a quantitative variable can take on a large number of values. So in general, it's not going to make sense to count the frequency of each individual value. Instead, we put the values into groups or classes, and we typically call these classes, and then count the number of values in each class. So rather than create a frequency table, as we did for qualitative data, we're going to create a grouped frequency table, and then later a grouped relative frequency table. So rather than looking at individual values, we're going to look at groups of values, ranges of values. Second, while categories don't have a natural order, so in a bar graph we can put the bars in whatever order we want, numbers do have a natural order, just numerical order. And so we're going to think about the shape or distribution of the values for that variable. We'll talk more about this later, but that's why we're often going to talk about a grouped frequency distribution. So I'm going to go over the process of how to create a grouped frequency table, and then we're going to see this process in an example. The first step in this process, and kind of the most complicated, is to calculate what's called the class width. You should think of this as telling you how many values are going to be in each class. And we have this formula for the class width, where we just take the difference between the maximum and the minimum value, right? So we're thinking we've got this range of values from the min to the max. And between there, we've got a range of values. And we want to split them up into a number of classes that we pick. So we might want to divide it evenly into 5 classes. And when we do this division, we get typically a decimal. And when we do that, we want to always round up. Our goal is that our class width be slightly wider than what we get if we split the data up completely evenly. And we'll see why in just a minute. Now, technically, I've got this little footnote here. That footnote says the class width always has to be bigger than the result of this division. So if you don't have to round up, if you don't have to round at all, you need to add a little bit to it. We won't see that happen in this class, so this is not relevant to us. But keep in mind that your class width should always be a little bit bigger than that space size. The second thing we're going to do is to compute where we're going to start our first class. And the idea is we don't want any of our class boundaries, any of the borders between our classes, to be exactly equal to any of the values. So we're going to subtract a half from our smallest value to get where to start our first class. And what we want to do is go 1 decimal place beyond the data values. If we have whole numbers, we want to subtract a half. If we have 1 decimal place, we want to subtract a half of 1 decimal place, so that's 0.05, and so on. Okay, so that's the tricky part. The tricky part is figuring out how to start. Once we know how to start, we're going to calculate the boundaries for each class. To do that, we'll take our first lower class boundary, add the class width to it. That's the upper boundary of our first class. Then the upper boundary of our first class becomes the lower boundary of our second class. So we'll add the class width again and again and again. And finally, this last part is very similar to what we did for qualitative data. We're going to count the number of values in each class. And in order to do that, we're going to use the same trick that we did for the qualitative data. We're going to go through the data table in order, and we're going to determine what class each one's in and tick it off. So that's the overview of the process. If it feels like this process is really complicated when I say it, it kind of is. It's much less complicated when we actually do it in practice. So in the next video, we're going to actually do this in practice, and we'll see how these steps actually work out.